Hey everyone, welcome to Let Me Tell You Why That's Bullshit, Canadian Election Edition. The podcast for the maple syrup might be sweet, but the campaign promises, we haven't figured that out yet. I'm Nick, your host.
And I'm German.
It's April 16th, and while the tulips are blooming, so are the talking points. Today, we're taking a blowtorch to the political spin and asking the big, uncomfortable questions politicians hope that we just won't. Early voting is exploding, party platforms are multiplying like rabbits, and the energy policy arms race between Carney and Poilievre is giving us whiplash. Meanwhile, young men are sliding right, young women are holding the progressive line, and everyone's stuck in their own algorithmic echo chamber. Is this just the TikTokification of democracy, or the start of something deeper and more divisive? We'll unpack the promises, the polls, and the posturing, and maybe, just maybe, we'll figure out what any of this means for real people living real lives. So grab your coffee, your anxiety meds, and your electoral cynicism, because we're about to dive in.
We have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
Okay, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm good. I was watching about a half hour of the French debate before we popped on, so I enjoyed watching them yell at each other. So that might be an indication of how the rest of this campaign is going to go.
Sounds like it's no surprise, though. Sounds like it's always been like that.
Yeah, I don't think it is, especially with two of the leaders not having really done campaigns and these types of debates before. So I think it'll be interesting. I'm going to watch the English debate tomorrow and the rest of the French debate after we finish. So quick plug for next week. We're going to talk debates next week and break that all down. I'm interested to see like if they change anything too I always like to see if they change from the French to the English and like tighten themselves up.
Yeah, there would definitely be a bit more comfortable for sure, right? Especially Carney.
Oh, yeah, well, his French is terrible, apparently, so
He's
I can't tell.
He's practicing, so I guess that's something for him, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Apparently, though, like the polls are showing, and people like reporters that are talking to people in Quebec, like they don't seem to care. Like this is very much still, as we talked about last week, an election of like, who do you want to deal with Trump? Poilievre or Carney. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to talk about the buzz that's happening with early voters. So I don't know how much of this you saw this week, but Elections Canada is reporting that early voting is off the charts. So for our listeners that don't know, advanced polls do open this Friday, where you can go into a polling station in your neighborhood and vote your regular way. But at any point during a Canadian campaign, you can actually go into, what did it say in the manual?
It said you can go to the polling stations from until April 22nd at 6 p.m. and you can vote.
Stations? No, the electoral office, right?
The electoral office. Sorry.
The electoral office. Yeah,
yes.
That's what it was.
Yes.
So you can go into an electoral office. The only caveat is you have to know who you're voting for because it's a write-in. But over 130,000 Canadians have already voted that way, which is double the voting turnout at this stage of the last election campaign in 2021. So I thought that was interesting. Another number that they were talking about was 348,000 plus Canadians have requested special ballots. Now, at this stage in 2021, that's only 4,000 more than last time. But in 2021, only 45,000 special ballots were returned at this stage. So this is quite interesting. So I thought I would just have a conversation with you about like kind of your take on this. Early voting's always interesting because it usually means a sign of change is coming. Like that's when like Canadians get amped up. We saw that when the NDP won in Alberta, if you remember, way back when. It seems like a lifetime ago. But we saw like early voting was like way up. But I don't know, like, I don't think that's it. I don't think it's necessarily changed. I think it's just that this is a really important election. So like I have my thoughts on it, but what are your thoughts first? Like what do you think this is? Is this like a change thing, or is this a holy crap, we got to deal with Trump thing?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that can be drawn from the information you provided and the information that's going around on the internet, right? And the few points that I would like to make is that yes, it definitely means that maybe a change could be in the air, but at the same time, it could also mean that people are very taking this seriously because of the Trump factor. They want certain things. They want stability. Maybe they're realizing that they need to do something about it. But at the same time, it's hard to read into these polls, as you can imagine. But at the same time, I think it's people being more engaged in the process. Personally,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's necessarily because people I've heard stories that people who said they vote for conservatives are now voting for liberals because they wanted Carney in there. So I think it's hard to say which way people are swaying, but at the same time, people are definitely worried about Trump, and I think that's a given. But at the same time, is it because they want Carney or Poilievre? It's hard to say because you can't really trust polls sometimes because polls have been so wrong.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say, but at the same time, you definitely know people are definitely engaged and they're taking this seriously. But who knows at this point who they're choosing, because they could go into a poll and vote for these people, but yet choose someone else totally different.
It's just interesting that it's happened so early. I feel like if this was happening, like maybe if we had advanced voter turnout over Easter weekend, which is another thing to consider, right? Like Easter weekend's coming up. So I'm amped to see what kind of numbers we get over the long weekend. But I feel like people may have made up their minds quite early on in this campaign. Like they're just looking at it and going, okay, you guys have been saying the same things. Who do I think is going to do better against Trump? What has Carney done in the last couple of weeks? What has Poilievre said? I don't know. Like, I don't know that it's, and obviously, yeah, people being more engaged, right? Which I'm happy to see, people being like, oh, maybe I should pay attention to things that are happening in the US that impact us. Maybe I should be paying attention to what these two leaders are saying they're going to do to combat things like inflation, cost of living, tariffs. Rio and I talked about, I know you haven't listened to the episode yet, but Rio and I took everybody through, which went up today, everyone. So if you haven't listened to it yet, go back, listen to that one first. But Rio and I looked at the Nintendo Switch 2 and how that's being impacted by tariffs. So I don't know how much like you're into gaming and that kind of stuff, but really quick overview of that. Basically, Nintendo did their big price drop and announcement on April 2nd. April 2nd at 4:00, Trump made his announcements on tariffs. Big twist in this was that Trump announced 46% tariffs on Vietnam. Meanwhile, Nintendo thought they were playing it safe by moving their Switch 2 production to Vietnam, away from China. So by Wednesday afternoon, Nintendo had pulled all of their pre-orders and said, price might be going up. We know you all hate the $450 USD price tag, but sorry. And then analysts came out by Wednesday night saying, yeah, these tariffs could cause the switches to go up to $660 USD in America, which is insane. So it was like a really good kind of case study of affordability and like where people are at and how these tariffs could be impacting not just Americans, but Canadians. Nintendo pulled Canada's pre-orders too. And people are trying to figure out, well, does this mean Canada's price is going up? Like, do our Nintendo Switches, are they going to be coming from the US? Because if they're coming from the US, they've been tariffed when they've gone into the US, right? So there's like all these questions around like what that might mean. And I think people are just really starting to pay attention. And yeah, Switch is a luxury item, but the point of bringing that up is it really demonstrates like that, like how much that's going to raise prices, right? Because it is a bigger price ticketed item.
Yeah,
so
for sure. And you look at what's going on with iPhones, for example.
That's another good example.
Yeah, and they brought in all these iPhones, so then they wouldn't be able to don't have to raise the prices. And then on top of that, you hear Trump, for example, talked about the fact that smartphones and computers are now exempt for a certain amount of period.
Can you
So
back that up? I was like, I was trying to like follow
and
it because he's so like back and forth.
I know,
'Cause I
and
know
it's like, and he's just saying it's like 30 days reprieve and all this crap.
But
And it's like,
did he? Because originally I heard that he said, okay, electronics are exempt.
it's a
And then
special
somebody in the
exemption,
administration said, well, no, they're not exempt. And
but
so
they're
like,
still
I
going
don't know
on.
where it's at now.
It's a special exemption on iPhones, computers, and things like that.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's just how can you keep track of these things? It's just so
Well, and the
outrageous.
fact that he just goes back and forth, right? Like,
Yeah,
because he like took it away at one point.
it says smartphones and chips excluded from Trump's latest tariffs, and so he backpedals on it because
Yeah,
electronics.
that's what I thought. Yeah.
But he warns that exemptions will be short-lived and promises that they will be back in place in future tariffs. So it's hard to even follow it. And that was about 2 or 3 days ago, like on Monday.
Right.
So,
Who knows where we're at now? He could be making an announcement while we're recording this.
and it's laptops too, right? And it's like from China. Remember that. This is from China. So it's like, oh my gosh, right? What's going on here all of a sudden, right?
Insanity. And so I think kind of bringing it like back around to the main topic, I think Canadians are just like, I don't want to say panicking. I think they're just paying attention and they realize that this is an important election. It's probably the most important election. You've heard me say it before. I'm probably going to say it again since the 1988 trade election.
But like on that story, like I remember last time we had higher voter turnout, the voter turnout did go up.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's going to be way up.
So it's definitely will go up. There's definitely more engagement. So it definitely will go up to some extent. It's just how high it will go up.
Yeah.
And how many people will actually vote on election day is the question. And that would be the benchmark, right? Because we could still have a high advanced poll. But like you said, like 45,000 people returned those ballots last time, which a lot of people requested them, but they never returned them. So did they go to the polls? That's something that is interesting to see, right, down the road.
Yeah.
You can't really track that, unfortunately, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not ignoring you. I was just on Election Canada's website while you were talking, on their voter turnout thing.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's like quite interesting. In 1900. Okay, that makes more sense. I was like, 1990. What happened in 1990? So it looks like our highest turnout ever was in 1900, and we had an 80% voter turnout. And then second to that is 1958, where we had just between 77%, it looks like. And then it kind of hung there. But what was the 1988 election?
But do I think we're going to get 80% of people voting? That'd be insane.
No, I think it's going to be much closer to 1988. That's what I wanted to look up. So 1988, 75% of people turned out to vote.
That's pretty good.
Think, I don't know. Let's do predictions.
Okay.
That's always fun. Okay, let's do predictions. Okay, so 1988 was like the most comparable election. That was a trade election. They had 75% voter turnout. I'm going to predict 65%.
I'll predict, I'll predict 68%.
Ooh.
I think it will be it will be closer to 70, but I think 68 is a good conservative number to predict.
You're so funny. Okay, I'm gonna write this down and I'm gonna keep it in our notes, and then
ask Rio. You should talk to Rio when you get a chance and ask him too as well.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. I'm gonna write.
And then whoever's closest has to buy dinner for that.
When we all go out.
Yes.
Who's ever closest?
Yes.
Ah, that sucks to be the winner.
No, like whoever's
farthest away.
Yeah. Pardon me. Yeah, furthest away. Pardon me. That it should be furthest away.
Yeah.
Has to buy
and then
dinner
we'll look at it. We'll look at it on. So for everybody listening, we are going to do, and you're able to do that, right? On the Tuesday. Monday's the voting day.
Yeah.
So Tuesday we're gonna do a podcast, and we'll we'll see who's closest. I'll get Rio's number. I'll text him and see. But I do think that that's really interesting. Like, where are we going to see voter turnout?
But also remember, certain polling stations will have higher turnout, especially in Calgary. Certain ridings are in play. right? Or even
That's
across
super
Canada.
interesting too, because, and I originally had this in our notes, and since you bring it up, it's now back in our notes. I was watching CBC this week, and there's one Calgary Confederate. It looks like it is a super tight knit race between the Conservative and the Liberal, which is crazy. And the Liberals, it looks like, are on poise to possibly win 5 seats in Alberta, which is
huge.
crazy. We do know that Edmonton goes fairly liberal in the provincial elections. They usually go orange for NDP. But federally, Alberta really is blue. Even right now, Alberta's still at 27 seats. The Liberals are up to 9 in projections. That's crazy.
That's insane.
I don't think they're gonna get 9.
If they
There's
get
no way.
If they get 9, that's insane.
If they get 9, I'll buy you all drinks for a night.
We're holding
By
you
that
to
I mean
that.
Rio and my team, not listeners.
No, the drinks are for us. You have to be part of the team. I'm excited.
Team.
I'm excited for the
But
drink.
like, that's still pretty crazy for it looking like there could be 9 seats.
Did they say which ridings particularly?
They don't, but I'm actually going to make a note because I think it would be interesting to go and look that up for next week's talk. But my guess would be Edmonton. There's 2 in Calgary that I know of, Calgary Confederate, and there's that one Liberal MP.
The problem with his riding is split. It went from, it used to be Skyview or something like that. Now it's split into something else, right?
Well, and that's what they're kind of saying, right? And when you split ridings like that, it's sort of interesting to see how that impacts voting, right? Like one of the big things that you see in Calgary, like in the Alberta election where the NDP won, was university ridings. And I'll never forget the Glenmore, whatever the Glenmore area riding is. I used to volunteer for a criminal justice society, and we had our meeting a few days after the election, and there is a guy that came in on our team, and he was pissed. Like, he was so mad. He started yelling about it like before he'd even sat down and taken his jacket off. And you know, me, the like university liberal, I'm just sitting there kind of smirking. But it turned out the reason why he was mad, and this was huge, that Glenmore riding only lost, like, it was only like 2 votes difference, something crazy like that. It was really low. It was under 10 votes that mattered. And they recounted that riding, if you remember, like 6 times. And he was pissed because he had said to his mother the night before, come on, we're going to vote. And she said, no, I'm not going to vote. Like, I'm tired and it's not going to matter. And so he was so mad at his mom. His mom was like a staunch conservative. And so it just kind of speaks to like, make sure you vote, especially in areas where it's really close, right? So we have a couple of close ridings here in Calgary. There's some really close ridings in the auto industry ridings in Ontario. They could go either way. And I guess I would just say like polling, I guess we're talking polls earlier than we thought again. But I guess I would say like, even though the polls look like it's crazy and it's definitely going to go one way or the other, keep in mind that this is still like a neck and neck situation. So if you're a liberal voter that's like, oh, I'm scared of Poilievre, like I really want to make sure that he stays out of office, like don't get comfy, go vote. If you're a conservative who's thinking like, oh, there's no point, like Poilievre's going to get destroyed here, like go vote. Because even though these numbers are looking like, you know, a liberal majority is guaranteed, we don't know what's going to happen. Like, who knows? Somebody might do something somebody might be doing something really dumb in the French debate right now that completely changes Quebec.
Yeah, and honestly, every vote counts. I remember there was a lot of ridings before that they were winning by like 50, 60, 100 votes, maybe even 10,
Mhm.
15 votes, and every vote counts. And you must make sure that vote counts, because it can make the difference. That one vote can make the difference between your particular person you want and the other person not getting in. So I know there were a few elections in even the city level that were like so close to call, and they were
Yeah.
so tight. And even the provincial elections, they were so tight. They were off by like 50 votes. That
Well,
makes a huge difference.
my MLA, he only won by something like 1,500 votes. Like it was really close in my riding, and I'm in like a trades area. So I even remember saying, like, the NDP guy came to my house, and I was like, dude, don't waste your time talking on me. You already have me. Just go to my neighbor's house. Just just move on. I'm voting like next week, buddy.
And,
Go. But
that's
he
so
only
important.
lost by 1,500 votes, which is huge.
And it's getting closer by the day now. It's like every vote counts, and like, yeah, you may never know, but at the same time, that vote could make the difference. If there's 10 votes, that one vote can make the difference. So really get out and vote, and that's so important. So going forward.
Awesome. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to what they're saying this week. So first, I thought we'd talk about where they have like shared goals. So there's, well, kind of two areas in which both parties more or less agree. They just disagree in how to carry it out. So the first is energy. So both parties said this week that they basically want national energy corridors and accelerated project approvals. So Mark Carney proposed reducing approval times for infrastructure projects from 5 years down to 2 years. Poilievre wanted an even faster timeline, proposing a 1-year maximum with a target of 6 months for approval. Both leaders emphasized the need to streamline regulatory processes to boost Canada's energy sector and economy in order to diversify, and we'll get to that after we talk about energy. And then in terms of the actual corridors, Carney wants digital infrastructure and trade routes. He's also talked about wanting to make sure we get that pipeline to Eastern Canada, whereas Poilievre's plan focuses on a dedication to pipelines only, really, Canada first, and more railways, transmission lines. And then he didn't talk about it this week, but last week and the week before, he mentioned the coal corridor in Northern Ontario and how he wants to make sure that that's opened up, which for him means the repeal of Bill, I don't want to get this wrong. I wish I'd looked it up. I want to say Bill C-69. That may be incorrect, but it's basically the one the Liberals brought in for environmental regulations, which is why those coal mines are currently closed down in Ontario. So that's where they both sit in terms of energy. So it's kind of interesting that both of them have, well, not so much pivoted, because that's always sort of been the conservative edge, but the Liberals in this case have pivoted to a more nationalistic output on here, which, like, I live in Alberta, so I'm all for that. Like, at the end of the day, that's how Canada makes our money, is we are a highly natural resource country, whether we kind of like it or not. So I was kind of glad to hear this. For me, and I know I'm going to get massacred again in the comments, this kind of emphasizes, though, more that we are really picking between a progressive conservative and a more nationalist conservative. Like, I think at this point, after hearing Carney talk this week, we are looking at a more like progressive conservative leader in the Liberal Party. And what I mean by that is Justin Trudeau was very left. Carney's bringing it more center than before. Rightfully so. I mean, looking at our economy. So what did you make of this when you heard it?
Yeah,
And how do you think Canadians are going to react?
I think it's a good step for sure. But I feel like it's hard to really propose these one, especially Poilievre, for example, a 1-year maximum.
I was just going to say, I was like, if you don't bring it up, I want to talk about
That
this.
is insane. Like 1 year is like
With a
super
target of
fast.
6 months.
Yeah,
That's
and
his
that doesn't even make
maximum.
sense. That even doesn't even make sense. Personally, 1 year is super fast. 6 months for approval. We know how bureaucratic the government is, just in general. Like we know how things don't get through. Like you hear about the passports from before,
Oh man, the passports.
and things like that. I know, like it's just crazy. And you working in the pipeline and environmental consulting industry before, it takes such a long time to get those pipelines approved. I worked on the Trans Mountain expansion project, and that project took ages to get through the line. And the government had to buy that pipeline project. So to propose something like 1 year maximum with 6 months of approvals, that's a really tight turnaround. Not saying that Mark Carney's proposal is great either, but at the same time, at least it sounds a bit more realistic. Like 5 years to 2 years, yeah, it sounds a bit more realistic. But at the same time, we know how these governments change super fast, and you know how, if especially if it's a minority government, how they can fall. So if another government comes in, they may just scrap those things. So it's really hard to say whether these things would actually happen. And like I know, like after like 6 months of approval, like there's lots of things that, like, even with my work, you have to go through approval process, you have to do the studies, there's aquatic studies, there's cultural studies, there's archaeological studies.
Who cares? Poilievre is gonna do aquatic.
It doesn't make
studies?
sense.
That's what he's cutting.
It doesn't make
100%.
sense.
He's
And
gonna be like, we don't need that.
and also
That's
on top of
fine.
that, Poilievre wants to cut the government too, right? So it's like, I
So
don't know.
how are you gonna do? Yeah.
And these accidents that may occur might be a problem too, right? So you really have to
God,
go
I'm
through
glad you brought that up because I just wrote that down.
we really have to think about these things through. And I think that, like, not to say Mark Carney is a great proposal either, but at the same time, at least it sounds a bit more realistic in paper. Whether it actually happens is another story, right?
Yeah, and I guess when I heard this, there was, like you, I had a few things. So the first was bureaucracy. You kind of covered that, but like the Indigenous consultation that they're required to do is going to take 6 months to a year on its own.
Mhm.
And that's by law.
That's
Now
a pain in the ass. That's a pain in the ass. Let me tell you. Like
I'm sure it is.
I worked
but
on stakeholder engagement,
the
and
law.
I read the logs of these stakeholder engagements, and I remember working on Trans Mountain. You have people against it, you have people for it, and these stakeholder engagements. You know how much consultations they had to do for Trans Mountain expansion project, and I only worked 4 months on that project, and I had logs like crazy from all these Indigenous leaders and councils and everything like that.
And
I
they don't agree either. Like
I know.
if you like read about what's happening in the Arctic right now,
Mhm.
even they're like split on what to do. So
Yeah. And I dealt with
you want to do that in 6 months?
I dealt on one of the projects. I dealt with I called farmers to advise them of their land too, and I tell you, some of the farmers were great, but others were saying, "No freaking way are you going to be coming and doing any pipeline through our land." So how are you going to convince them to take over their land? And if there's cultural like artifacts or cultural stuff on the site, you can't even touch that. And so
Yeah.
you really have to get permits to remove it, and then you have to get an archaeologist to dig it out, and that takes 6 months to a year again. So there's
Yeah.
so much more work that goes involved than just saying 6 months. And like with no government stuff and regulations, it's going to be so much more difficult too, right?
Right. And like, so there's that problem. And then the second concern I have is, let's just say, because honestly, at this point, I'm like, okay, Poilievre, you're either lying or you're just gonna cut a whole bunch of processes.
Mhm.
I don't think he's lying. I think he's going to cut a whole bunch of red tape like the UCP have done in Alberta. And I think one of those things will be telling Indigenous people that he doesn't care what they think. That's just my kind of prediction based on his history under the Harper government in the legislation that he got passed as a cabinet minister. But let's put that aside for a moment. Once he does that, as you said, what about accidents? Like, if he's cutting that process to 6 months to a year, you're increasing accidents tenfold, at least.
And
in
honestly,
the infrastructure development.
accidents are a pain too to deal with, like spillwage, and like you have all of these companies having problems with
Also, accidents are dangerous, and we care about human life.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I don't know how you can even do it in the time frame required. And so not to
No,
say
I don't think
Carney's
you can.
proposal was any better too, but at the
No,
same time,
2 years? That's laughable.
yeah, like, but at the same time, his proposal sounds more realistic. And honestly, like 2 years
But
is
he's
so
gonna have
fast.
to cut too. Like,
Look at how
where is he gonna cut?
look at all these things to build, like all these buildings to build. You need to go through so much work just to build anything.
But at least, like, okay, so here's the thing. At least Poilievre, we know what he's going to do. Like, I can look at this and be like, well, we know that when he went to the Arctic, he didn't even talk to the indigenous people up there. So we can kind of figure out where some of his cutting's going to be. But what is Mark Carney's plan here? Because he's from the Northwest Territories. He's talked a lot about the importance of indigenous knowledge and consultation. So how in the hell does he plan on getting it down from 5 years to 2? I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to cut approval times in order to further our economy. I just don't know how feasible that is. I mean, look at how they built the ring road in Calgary. Like, and that was just a road that had indigenous consultation.
You know how long it took
like
to build
a decade.
It took 30 years to build that ring road.
But like once it started going, right?
Yeah.
Like if you think about the consultation they did on the west side, so for people that aren't familiar with like Calgary politics, basically the government had to go in, they negotiated with the Tsuut'ina and paid them for part of their land to put the road through, which, fine, whatever. But where it got really sticky is governments don't do anything fast. And they actually had a deadline where if they didn't have that road completed by a certain date, it reverted back to Tsuut'ina Nation. And they didn't have to give the money back. So it was just like a too bad for you situation. And it was 30 years of planning, and it took about a decade to do, like once they started actually building the ring road, it took like a decade to do. So you're telling me that you're going to get a pipeline built across Canada where you have to deal with like archaeological stuff, indigenous consulting, things like farmers. And I've dealt with farmers for nonprofits in areas where like farmers did want the stuff, and it was still a long process.
Another example in Calgary is Arts Commons, for example. Arts Commons, for people who don't know Arts Commons, is it's one of the biggest arts facilities in Canada. And they're building.
I didn't know it was one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest in Canada. It's like the first in Western Canada and the third largest in Canada.
I'm not surprised. It's huge.
And the thing about Arts Commons is that it took so long for them to get their stuff done as well. Like, and they finally got the funding this past year to build that. And that's a pain too, right? And there's all the studies. Like, I remember they were saying there's envelope studies they need to do because the ground is not level. And so can you imagine, like, there's all these problems you find on this land that you have to look after.
And I guess the other thing about their like plan for cutting the time is we haven't even talked about jurisdictional consultation. Like, if they don't think that dealing with Quebec and putting a pipeline through Quebec isn't going to take 6 months on its own, I have a bridge to sell, Poilievre, because if you remember, Quebec was the reason that pipeline didn't get built under Harper, because they just like dug in. I mean, it didn't help that at the time, was it CN Rail? Yeah, CN Rail. I believe it was CN Rail. One of the big railways had a major accident that involved oil in Quebec. So once that happened, they were very sensitive about building a pipeline, obviously, right? Because it's one thing to have, the oil spill from like trains, but that was a huge disaster at the time. Now, with that said, that's a good segue into the second thing that they're kind of like on par with, which is reducing US dependency. Both of them have come out and said, obviously, since all this tariff stuff and like Trump, that they want to like diversify. It sounds like Carney and Trudeau kind of before him has basically been able to get all of the premiers on board. even Danielle Smith, to some extent, she's still pretty like, what's the word I'm looking for? She still like talks a lot about hating liberals and thinking that that part of the government is stupid. But at the end, she has come out and said like a couple of things that were very like on message about it. But she has pointed out that like, okay, you want to put a pipeline through Quebec, like there is that understanding that that's going to be a hurdle. And even though Quebec might be on board with that, like there's still going to be caveats that they have, right? And rightfully so, because of their experience with the railway. So like I said, both Carney and Poilievre came out again this week emphasizing the need for diversification into different markets. Poilievre, what was interesting here though, is Poilievre wants to meet that by key energy sector demands, which shouldn't be surprising. He's very national resource based. Whereas Carney has emphasized developing both clean and conventional energy. So that would be like, not just like solar and all of that, but also oil. So I guess I kind of just wanted to have a quick conversation about that difference, because I think it's really important. And we've seen in Alberta this play out. As you probably know, we're both very up on Alberta politics. And last year, one of the things that the UCP did was basically ban research and investment in clean energy in Alberta, which I know actually impacted my family directly. My brother-in-law was supposed to be on a solar panel job and lost that job because Danielle Smith was like, so I kind of wanted to just have a conversation about the importance of, I guess, like sort of developing Canada's clean energy versus the understanding that like conventional energy is where Canada shines right now. Like it or not, you need to develop that. The world still relies on oil. Versus kind of Poilievre's thing where he's just like, no, just traditional energy. So I'm going to shut up now and let you talk.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. It should be also noted that Pierre has received a number of business executives also endorsement. So I think it also has to. It's interesting because like it shows that Carney is really trying to keep the environment in mind right now, for sure, but at the same time trying to make sure we grow the economy, and that is an interesting approach because it's not necessarily like, I know people keep on debating whether the carbon tax and whatever is still allowed and stuff like that, or whether it's been cut, but at the same time it seems like Pierre is really focused on the energy sector, which is, like you said, is Canada stuff for sure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I get why that Carney is doing that environment side, because that's important to their party and their base, right? Those people really want those areas, right?
Well, like Carney's well known for that, right? Like,
and he's definitely well known, and you can see why users are receiving those endorsements, right, from business executives, because they feel like that they must drive entrepreneurship, they must be innovative, they must have lower taxes and develop natural resources and curb spending, which aligns directly with what he's doing. He's playing to his base of people, right? Which is why those executives are actually supporting him. Like people from Scotiabank, people from Berkshire Energy, these are big, and Canada, like these are big name people who are supporting Poilievre because they feel like that he can bring those people, like Aspen Properties, like the list goes on. Like it's like Mainstream Equity Corp, like all these people are big name people and players. So they definitely feel like that he's speaking them, like he's definitely tapping to their base of people. Yeah. Right. And so I think that's where it's going. But at the same time, maybe that's where Carney is also, he's tapping to his base as well. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that Carney has always been known as an economist that also, I don't want to say like cares about the environment, because I don't know Carney personally. And since he's a billionaire, I'm highly suspicious of him. But with that said, some of his biggest projects have been with the UN on environment.
That's right.
As an official economist.
I think he was an envoy. I think it was called.
Yeah, I think you're right. But
yeah, and I remember hearing that too, and I think that should be also noted because he's always been pro-environmental.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And like he's also speaking not only his base, but his values and what he
Which
stands
I
for.
think is why he chose, when he did move politically, to move into the Liberal Party. We've talked before about how he's a little bit more conservative, but I think that's kind of, if I had to take a guess, I would say that's how he ended up more aligned with Liberals than Conservatives, because he has in the past been offered positions within the Conservative Party of Canada, which I think is also important to note, especially right now. Harper endorsed, obviously, Poilievre last week. It would be weird if he didn't. But he also alluded to the fact that he was very clear. He was like, Carney didn't work for me, which I think was really interesting, in that he wanted to sort of bring a separation between him and Mark Carney. But if we look back in history, Harper actually offered Mark Carney the finance minister position when he left the Bank of Canada. So it's not like he hasn't had the opportunity to be in both parties politically before. And so I think that environmental thing just sort of positions him on the spectrum.
For sure. And I think that's important to note because he definitely was offered positions with Harper. And of course, it's interesting to see now Harper saying, he didn't work for us. It's very interesting, because it's kind of like you're trying to distance yourself from the guy you really wanted now that he's on the opposite team, right? It's just a bit hypocritical, but it's something ironic, because they really courted him. Huh?
It's fascinating what humans will do sociologically.
And it's like, holy cow, like what's going on now? So I guess you're an enemy now, right?
I mean, unlike other people, so my big thing is I hate politics as a team sport. And I have been lambasted in comments, which is why I don't read comments anymore. I leave that up to these two. But one of the things, because I'm more of a liberal ideologically, I'm not a part of any party in Canada, but I do have a more liberal leaning perspective on things. So I like social programs. I think those are important. My household, as an example, has a higher income rate. It would be in my best interest to vote Conservative. Right now, I'm not, because I don't agree with Poilievre's ideological policies. But I have voted Conservative in the past. Rio's going to murder me when he listens to this and finds out. So if I go missing and suddenly Rio's here next week, y'all know why. But I am also very against politics as a team sport. It drives me absolutely crazy that here in Alberta, I have friends that are like, well, there's been just 3 generations in my family. We've always voted Conservative. That's so, for me, I just feel like it's so dangerous not to evaluate political parties on their policies and instead associate them with your identity. Now, with that said, obviously somebody like Harper, it kind of is politics as a team sport for politicians, right? Mark Carney is Team Liberal. Jagmeet Singh is Team NDP. And I think it's really important to remember that these politicians, including Harper, have investments in their parties. So it's very important to actually look at these policies and be critical of them and point out when they're exactly the same, when they're just mirroring each other.
Yeah, and I've full disclosure, I've been part of all different types of parties, right? And I voted for all different types of parties. Yes,
in different capacities, right?
Yeah, in different capacities, and plus, and probably people can tell I am more socially liberal and more fiscally conservative.
You're
right?
I would place you dead center. I'd be like, you're dead center.
Yeah, and that's nice, because that's where I consider myself. But at the same time, I'm sure a lot of my friends listening and a lot of my friends who talk to me know and feel that I'm more liberal in nature. Yes,
You're not conservative enough.
Yeah, I love these social programs. I think they're really important, like Nick was saying. But at the same time, I think we need to have a strong economy. We need to have balanced budgets, all those things. Remember, I come from the business world, working in finance and accounting. So those things are so important.
Yeah. And as we talked about last week, my concern is I know that Poilievre's going to pay for everything by cutting stuff. I know that when Poilievre says, I'm going to cut XYZ, Poilievre's going to cut XYZ. what we still don't know with Mark Carney is, because like when he gets asked by reporters, oh, so you're going to run a deficit, he always says no, but he hasn't actually said how he's going to invest in all this infrastructure, maintain all of our social programs, and magically not be running a deficit. He has talked a little bit about like bringing in, as we talked about last week, the private sector to get them to, how did he put it? And he was still talking about it this week, that for every dollar the government puts in, his goal is to have the private sector put in. But like what does that mean? And how is the private sector going to benefit from that? And I think that's a really important question to ask.
And that's the concern I have with his stuff. He has great stuff. Some of it is realistic, but how is he going to pay for it?
Yeah.
And that's my problem. Like, yes, not that I'm criticizing Poilievre and saying his policies are bad, but Carney's is just as bad, if not worse.
At least we know. Like, I can look at Poilievre and say, okay, you're going to give these tax cuts to whoever you're going to give them to, but you're going to pay for them because you've said you're going to cut these social programs. I 100% believe that.
Yeah, and I'm sure he would. Like, I'm sure he would too.
Right?
And we know what he's going to do. Like, we know what the Conservative Party usually does when it comes to these things. But at the same time, Carney, I'm conflicted because he's not giving these things costed. He's not showing how we're going to pay for it. And that's my concern. Yes, I agree with some of the stuff that Poilievre is okay, but at the same time, it's not realistic, some of his promises.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I guess the thing with Poilievre, and we'll get into Poilievre's like what he said this week, but I guess to be fair, I'm also a little bit concerned with Poilievre because he's also keeps saying, no, I'm going to protect, for example, this week, which made me laugh. I'm sorry. He said, no, I'm going to protect dental care, like the new dental care program that the Liberals and NDP implemented. He voted against that now. He's voted against that his whole life, and suddenly he's going to protect it.
Yeah, it's kind of hypocritical to me.
Maybe, but like, if we're just looking at him, and I guess this is the nice thing about Poilievre, we have 20 years of him voting, of him putting legislation, getting it passed. Like, we know what he's done. He's gone after healthcare in the past. He's gone after worker legislation. Like, I don't know. I kind of looked at it and went, I don't really believe you. I think you're going to cut it.
Yeah, and I totally see that. Like, and I totally agree with you on a lot of those points too. And we've always known what the Conservatives like to do is they like to cut things, right? Just in general, right? And yeah, not to say I'm saying Mark Carney is the golden standard. No, not at all.
But he's also a conservative. Really? Like, we've talked about this. He is a red Tory.
Yeah.
What is he going to cut? What is he going to come out and say after this election? Oh, by the way, I'm actually going to cut these things. I think that's more my concern in it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm worried about. But at the same time, I'm looking at who's the better for the economy and who's the better for Trump and all these other factors. And you have to decide what is important for you, right? As well as voters, right?
Yeah, for sure. So anyway, that's kind of the Carney thing. He did one minor point, and Albertans probably hated this. On April 10th, Mark Carney rolled out a tough on crime platform of his own, completely different than Poilievre's, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But his was focused on public safety and community protection, firearms. So he wants to revamp the gun buyback program. The nice thing here is one of the things he wants to do is better compensate gun owners for those banned assault rifles, assault style firearms, in hopes of getting people to turn them in. I know people in Alberta and Manitoba and Ontario that like have banned assault rifles still because they haven't turned them into the government, which is like a whole other conversation because they're all registered. And I'm like, why isn't the government just taking it from you? But whatever. There's going to be, he's proposing new criminal laws to protect access to places of worship, schools, community centers, that kind of stuff. Automatic revocation of gun licenses for those convicted of violent crimes, which, like, why wouldn't you do that? And he wants to hire 1,000 additional RCMP officers to combat human and drug trafficking and organized crime in Canada, which I suspect is a border thing.
Yeah, that's the border thing, I believe, right?
Yeah. So I didn't want to spend too much time on this. It's pretty like regular liberal crime policy. But I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to kind of say
Not
about
much.
it before we move on.
Not much. I just want to say that, he's trying to help them. Like he's trying to create these like a conservative policy of safe communities and things like that. But at the same time, just balance it, right, with values, right, that are progressive in nature. That's all.
Yeah, and maybe we'll pin this for a minute, and maybe it'll be helpful if we kind of talk about like Carney's approach and Poilievre's approach at the same time. Because I think, as you know what's coming, I think it's really interesting, a community-based approach to a legislative-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So let's quickly talk about, I don't want to spend too much time on like what Poilievre has said outside of crime, but I think it's important to bring up kind of some of the stuff that he's pledged this week. So the first thing is the MAiD stuff, which is medical assisted dying in Canada. So he wants to halt all expansion of it to those that suffer from mental illness. Mm-hmm. He's pledged to do that, which directly contradicts the Liberal plan to expand to those with mental illness by March 2027. Carney's been pretty quiet on this, so we don't know the Liberals' position on this at this point. Yep. I'm sure it'll come out in their plan, though. And obviously, this has sort of ignited a little bit of a moral and legal debate, sort of among journalists, I guess. So there was that. He also took Blue Seal, that's what it was, Blue Seal fast track certification for foreign doctors and nurses. So he wants to basically see us certify them faster. We do, as you know, have a doctor and nurse shortage here. I don't know. So this one, maybe it's worth kind of having a conversation about real quickly, just because we do see, and one of the things right before we got on, when I was turning it off, Singh and Poilievre were fighting about exactly this, healthcare in Canada. And one of the things here is, he wants to introduce this Blue Seal fast track certification for foreign trained doctors and nurses, which, like, cool. I think that's needed. I mean, if for nothing else, like, it's insane that a doctor from even the UK has to go through so much more to not drive a cab in Canada. Is insane to me. Like, if you're a UK doctor and you specialize in, I don't know, anesthesiology, I'm going to assume that you can like figure that out in Canada.
Yeah,
the body does not change.
And I agree with that. Like not to discriminate with certain places, but I worked with a lot of people who were doctors at my different jobs, and it was so sad to see them having to, like, for example, one guy I remember when I was working at a temp job, he said he was offered a janitor job, and he's a medical doctor overseas. It's like, how insulting. You spend all of this time in school and you can't even get a proper job. Yeah, I get there's certain things from different countries and not to discriminate for certain people, but at the same time, it's just so sad that they don't even get there's some actually certification process to give them the opportunity to practice. Yes, there's some medical stuff you need to come up in Canada or even North America, but yeah, this is totally needed. It's common sense, right? By any means.
Don't use that phrase.
Sorry, Nicole.
Come on.
It's common sense, but at the same time, it's not common sense.
But Poilievre's common sense, as we're about to see, is very, very different from our common sense.
And that's the problem, right? But at the same time, like, is there problems with it? You bet there is, right?
Like, if I have to hear one more, like, federal leader be like, common sense governing, I'm going to throw my laptop out the window. But no, I agree with you. I 100% agree with you. And one of the things he did say is that he would use standardized testing to assess competency. And this would be like, you have your like British doctor versus maybe a doctor from a different part of the world that is maybe a little more sketchy. But here's one of the things that I saw, and of all places, Reddit. But it was a young person that was talking about how she's been trying to get into nursing school in Canada, but you have to have like a 95% average because they're so competitive and there's not very many spots, particularly in Alberta. So you know it's coming. And that's a direct result of the Conservative government in Alberta and Ontario cutting funding to universities. So I guess the other side of this is, yes, I agree with you, Poilievre. We do need that standardized testing and fast tracking. But why are you also not implementing policies here to A, incentivize young people to go into these professions, B, ensuring that our healthcare is on track? Right now, I don't know why anyone would want to go into healthcare in Alberta. Doctors are fleeing our province because of the state of it. And why you wouldn't be maybe part of your, and I'm not saying like whether or not I agree, like I think all education is important, but we do have a healthcare, I wouldn't say crisis yet, but like it's getting there. Like we need doctors and nurses. So why wouldn't you come up with a plan to work with provinces to ensure that the government's university funding, maybe you take X amount of that and it's a bigger portion that's going to go into nursing programs, medicine, right? Like, where's the other part of this, Poilievre? That's my thing.
Yeah, and I'm worried about also, like in Alberta especially, they're privatizing some of these healthcare services. And that's a totally another issue right now. And like we could spend hours on that conversation.
After the election's over, side note, the three of us should do a whole podcast on the privatization of healthcare in Canada.
Yeah, and honestly, look, you talk about, like, I don't want to go into detail because this is not on Danielle Smith's policies right now, but at the same time, you hear this thing about they want to split the AHS, Alberta Health Services, into 3 separate areas of businesses.
Oh my God, that whole gong show.
And honestly, that's a crazy situation too, and it's stressful.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, and I'm sure some of the listeners have heard about the fact that they're focusing on, like about this AHS CEO too. That's a totally another discussion as well. Yeah. Like, it's just a big mess right now, healthcare wide, and they want to privatize these things. And she's getting caught trying to offer private services.
That's a whole other. You could do an hour on that.
And that's crazy. Like, you think it doesn't even align with what he wants now, right?
Yeah.
So it's like there's some really disconnect going on.
Which again, I think that's part of Pierre's problem, right? I think he would like nothing more than for Danielle Smith to shut the F up and Trump to shut the F up. Because it would be a totally different election if those two would just stop talking for 5 minutes.
And honestly,
I gotta feel for him a little bit in this area.
And honestly, Danielle Smith is not going to shut up because she has a certain base she needs to represent, and that's what she's trying to represent. And like, we could do
a whole hour on that too.
Yeah, I don't want to go into it, but yes, but at the same time,
I think that also kind of plays into Poilievre too, right? Like, he needs to, and we talked about this last week, he needs to cater to the center because he needs those votes to win now. But he also has a base that kind of aligns, with Danielle Smith. So he has to kind of walk that line, and good luck. I don't know that he's done a great job of it, but there's still a couple weeks. So who knows? Okay. The other thing, he's still talking about affordable housing, which was another thing they were yelling at each other about, him and Singh, before we got on. So he pledges to Poilievre, reimburse cities for 50% of any development fee cuts up to $25,000 per home. Again, he also announced that the GST rebate on new homes. Here's the interesting part. This week he said, because remember last week we talked about how he didn't put a number on it, whereas Carney has. Well, now the Conservatives have put a number on it at $1.3 million. The total benefit being up to $115,000 for home buyers. So that's quite interesting because this is beginning to line up exactly with Carney's plan. So he talked about that. He also talked about cracking down on tax havens, which was kind of interesting. He wants to go after offshore tax loopholes, which I remember before the episode, I was kind of joking about, like, it's weird that a Conservative would be doing this. But the more I think about it, I think in part this is to pay for some of his own tax cuts that he wants to do, because that's going to bring in more tax revenue. So I think that's kind of where they're at here. He says that CRA resources would also be redirected away from small businesses towards corporate evaders, which kind of like reinforces my thought here that this is about like making sure that whatever money they are taxing people on, they can still get.
Yeah, and he's definitely trying to make it a wedge issue right now.
Yeah.
Right? And he's definitely trying to, because, we know Mark Carney previously managed these funds.
Yeah. He's also a billionaire, which we know that Poilievre, well, he might be a millionaire, he does not have billions.
And he's in right now, Pierre is trying to woo these working class voters, right? Which are not usually conservative people in nature.
Yeah.
So I think he's trying to move towards this trend, right? So
well, you know what else I think he might be trying to do here, just thinking about as you're talking. Remember, and we talked about this again last week, how for the Conservatives to win with numbers that they have now, which according to CBC poll tracker is 37.8%. That's a huge number. And usually that's enough for a Conservative to win a majority government in Canada. But the New Democrats have tanked and gone to the Liberals, which has put them out ahead. And so I think part of this is about like trying to convince NDP voters that he's not as much of a threat and it's totally fine to stay with their regular party. Because remember, we're in an ABC election at this point. NDP voters are really looking at this and saying, and the numbers show us this, that they are voting for Carney, not necessarily because they like Carney. They're scared of what Poilievre will do. It's kind of the same with how Poilievre, people flock to him while Trudeau was still the leader of the Liberal Party because they didn't like Trudeau. It had nothing to do with liking Poilievre. So I think part of bringing in some of these policies and talking more about affordable housing, he's trying to say to like NDP voters, like, I'm not as scary as they're making me out to be.
Yeah, and I think that's the case too, right? And he's trying to be like, he's trying to get those working class people. And that's what he's been trying to do. And is it working? It's hard to say because he still can't pull up that lead, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard, right? And is he successful at he's getting the business people to support him? And you see these business people trying to support him and say, we need him in power because he's the guy to fight for us, right? But at the same time, are people everyday people looking at this and saying it's going to help them? No, like for example, you look at this, home buyers credit stuff. If you can't buy a house again, it won't even matter.
Yeah.
So,
or if nobody has jobs, it's not going to matter.
It's not going to matter. So some of these policies are great, like for the people like us who can afford houses potentially, right? But other people can't. I know friends who can't even afford to buy a house. They're lucky. And so would they?
Are you saying the GST rebate isn't going to help them?
It wouldn't, because if they can't afford to buy a house, then how is it going to affect them?
How is it going to matter? Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't matter. Like that's great. Under 1.3 million, who cares? Like, am I going to buy a $1.3 million house in Calgary or even in Alberta? Not really, right?
Well, and that's sort of the other issue here, right? Like they're talking about all of these things to allow people to buy a $1.3 million home in like Toronto or Vancouver, but nobody's talking about how these homes shouldn't be $1.3 million. That is insane.
Yeah, that's one part of it, but also the rent.
Yeah, well, and that's the other part about affordability that both sides are ignoring here. I haven't heard them talk about how they're going to help with rental costs. People that are paying like my house, as an example, like I'll totally put myself out here. Our mortgage is $1,600 a month. If this house was being rented, it would probably in Calgary right now be rented for between $2,500 and $3,000 in the neighborhood, based on what I see houses going up for rent on our neighborhood Facebook page. That is crazy.
That's insane. Like, and the average person wouldn't be able to afford it. Like, remember we talked about last week about how much it costs to be comfortable living.
And then a bank is going to tell those people that they can't get a mortgage because that's too much of their overall income, even though they're already been paying that for like a decade. Like, it's just absolutely insane. And neither party is talking about this.
Yeah, and that's the middle class voters and the working class people you want to court. But at the same time, none of them are doing that.
Yeah.
None of them are getting those people. And like everyone talks about rent affordability, food, all of these things, but I don't see anything about these things. Like there's nothing related to these things. They're talking about new home. These are new houses too. Can you imagine if I buy my parents' house or I buy a house down the street?
And that's just it, right? Like a GST rebate isn't going to help a person that isn't buying new.
Yeah, and that's a problem.
GST.
And like, do I want to buy a new house? Not necessarily, right?
No, you in fact, as somebody whose best friend is a realtor, I know all of the problems that come with new homes. I also worked for real estate agencies for like 10 years. Trust me, do not buy new homes.
And on top of that, a new house, I can tell you, I have lots of friends who say, honestly, their house is a box.
Yeah.
And they're saying your house is nice. Or at least your parents' house would be nice, right? It's like amazing. Like if you can buy an older house, yes, you have to do a lot of work to it and renovate your house depending on how much work has been done. But that's a totally another issue.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, do I want to buy a new house? Not necessarily. It's so far out, number one, but also it's not as good, like you said, potentially, right? So
well, it's more like having to like deal with the developers and like the different warranties that are there, and the fact that like the nice thing about it is there are more like upgraded like regulations that they have to adhere to in like say a 2010 house versus like over in like the older communities in Calgary, like Minnapore, right? Where you have like trees that are currently eating into people's pipes because of the types of trees those developers planted. So like there's pros and cons, but there's definitely just like between the affordability of it and like the horror stories you hear about new home builds sometimes, like people are going to be looking at that. And again, going back to affordability, like who's going to be able to afford some of those like caveats of building a new home?
And these are new houses, not apartments, not condos, all these other things.
Well, no, it would apply to condos and
apartments,
townhouses and stuff. So like it's any new home that you buy, right? So like condos, apartments, and townhouses. So that could potentially help younger people who are trying to get into like condos and stuff. But again, that depends on where you are in the country. Like a friend of mine who's dad, without like doxing me or her, just owns like a very, very well-known company in Calgary. And she was like in a downtown Vancouver condo that was like a $3 million condo just because of location, right? So like it's not like condos are potentially any better in certain cities in Canada.
No,
but yeah, the GST rebate would apply to any new condo, townhome, anything that you're like flat out buying.
And that's good to know, right?
Yeah. So it would potentially help like maybe somebody that's buying a new condo, because that does happen. But that's still a very small portion of home buyers, like really.
Yeah.
But
I don't know, it's not like these policies are not great anyway, regardless who they are, right?
No, they're kind of like sucking on both sides, and it's not like the NDP is going to form government. So, and then like even if they did, we'd all be like really broke then.
We don't even have money to pay certain things right now already, right?
Well, I mean, the amount of tax increase that there'd have to be, like right before you came on, like I actually left the French debate when they were asking Singh like how he would pay for all the stuff he wants to do, and I was just like laughing because I was like, well, giant ass tax increases, people. Like, there's no other way to do that.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it's either you tax or you cut.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
people don't want to pay more taxes. Aren't cutting social programs.
And do people want to pay more taxes?
No. No. This is why like a lot of people are just kind of like dead center or far right conservative. Okay.
But it is what it is, right?
Yeah. So let's move on to something that I really wanted to talk about. This is definitely a me thing. I'm going to do a full disclosure here and say that I have a background in criminology. One of the first things I ever published was actually a criticism of Harper's tough on crime legislation, where I went through like 50 years of tough on crime law research in the US and Canada to sort of like unpack it all. This is important because the big thing that Poilievre has come out and said this week is he's proposing a 3 strikes US type crime law. So he wants to ban bail, parole, and house arrest for repeat offenders of serious crimes, would impose a 10-year maximum sentence after a third offense, or sorry, minimum mandatory sentence after a third offense, with the possibility of life imprisonment. And then he further announced minimum mandatory sentences for people convicted of murder. So I think it's important to note here a couple of things I want to go over. And this is relevant because we've seen this from the Conservatives before, and Poilievre was a part of the Harper government. So Stephen Harper's government did this. He had minimum mandatory sentences famously for 4 pot plants. And this went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court of Canada said, no, you can't have minimum mandatory sentencing. It is unconstitutional. For US listeners, we don't really have a constitution. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Also in Canada, we have something called the notwithstanding clause in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is basically to sidestep defying our rights. And in order to get this through, Poilievre has said, no, I'm going to use the notwithstanding clause. Now, the notwithstanding clause is supposed to be reviewed every 5 years. So it's temporary in theory. So, I mean, chances are, like, we've had a Liberal government for 10 years, but under normal circumstances, it's about year 10 that Canadians get pissed off with whatever government's in power, i.e. Harper, and then we got Justin Trudeau. The only reason it's not happening now is Trump. But I suspect if we move forward and say we get a Pierre Poilievre government and he does this, it would be about 10 years. So he would renew this once. Who knows what the Liberals would do when they get back in? They probably would just leave it. They've left a lot of Harper's tough on crime legislation that managed to stay in. I also want to point out that it's really important, as we talked about before, to really get into crime bills and like look at what they're doing. And I'll tell a story to kind of explain what I mean. A friend of mine actually worked with her MP to help push through some of Harper's tough on crime legislation. The reason she wanted this was because somebody in her family molested her daughter. And so tougher penalties for those convicted of sexual interference with a minor was something that was really important to her. And she knew at the time that I was writing this paper. She saw that I had it published and she was really angry at me. And she finally said, like, okay, can we just go to like a Starbucks or something? And like, you explain to me like why you have the position you have. And so one of the first things I did was I took out the comparisons of the Harper tough on crime legislation. And I said, okay, in the Harper tough on crime legislation, the Harper government has introduced a minimum mandatory sentence of 4 years in prison. In prison, that's federal prison for 4 pot plants. So that is 1 year per pot plant, which really isn't like trafficking levels. If you have 4 pot plants, you're just like getting high in your mom's basement at that point. So 4 years, 4 pot plants. And she said, yeah, okay, that seems a little stupid. And then I said, okay, but let's look at the minimum mandatory sentencing that got changed on interference of a minor. That legislation changed the minimum mandatory sentence of house arrest for 60 days to house arrest for 90 days. Let that sink in for a moment. 4 years minimum mandatory sentencing for pot plants. Minimum mandatory sentence from 60 days to 90 days on sexual interference with a minor, which is basically Canada speak for sexually assaulting a minor. If you are a tough on crime conservative like my friend was, she was pissed.
Yeah, it's not anything.
Right? It was in that moment that she started hating government officials. And she said, you know, I probably shouldn't have left that up to my MP. So keeping that in mind, I don't think Poilievre is that type of, like, I'm not saying that that's what he's going to do. But Harper's tough on crime legislation was pushed as protecting communities and children. Poilievre was a part of that government. So that's just like important to note, and like how these bills have intended to go. So moving on with the notwithstanding clause, if we look at like what he's doing and we go back and we're like, okay, this is unconstitutional, and it's because it would be the government basically stomping on our rights. There is a way for the conservative government, if they wanted to do this properly. And that is through the Oakes test. Now, I know you took criminal justice as well. Are you familiar with the Oakes test?
A little bit, not as much as probably you are. You're probably the expert more than I am.
This is like my jam. Okay, so the Oakes test was established, RV Oakes 1986. It's a two-part test used by the courts to decide if limiting a charter right is reasonable and justifiable in a free and democratic society. The government must show two things. One, that the law's objective is pressing and substantial, which means like it's, you know, highly needed. Say we're like the murder capital of the world or something, right? Like then the government could say like, this is like a big problem, we need to address it, and that's why we're doing this, right? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that the means are proportional. Sorry, I am reading, it's because I wanted to get the language right. The means are proportional, meaning the law must be rationally connected to the objective, impair the right as little as possible, and balance the benefits against the harm. So Poilievre doesn't want to do this, which should be a red flag to anyone that, okay, like there is a process that he can go through to get what he wants with the bail and parole and house arrest. I think it's also important for people to note, and this I think is why he doesn't want to do the Oakes test, because he might fail on this alone, particularly for the murder stuff, is we already have something called dangerous offenders designation in Canada. So we see this with Paul Bernardo, and before this piece of shit, Clifford Olson, died, he also was labeled a dangerous offender. So what does that mean? It means you're labeled a dangerous offender, and while you are allowed to apply for parole, you're not getting parole. It means that you've been deemed too dangerous to society, you haven't changed, and you're locked up forever. Now, both Clifford Olson and Paul Bernardo had applied for parole like every time they could. Clifford Olson, and I don't know, our listeners might not even be old enough to remember, but this was like a child murderer. And I'm not even like, that's not an exaggeration. This was a guy that was convicted of murdering children. So people were really, really pissed that he was able to apply for parole every single time it came up. Every single time he applied, and he was denied. Why? Because he was a dangerous offender, and the justice system was like, no, you haven't changed. Same with Paul Bernardo. And when Harper actually passed his tough on crime legislation at the time, Clifford Olson was still alive. He's since died in prison. Side note, it was a very slow and painful death. Yay. But Harper had said that he thought that, no, like, that is doing a disservice to victims of crime, right? Because every however many years they have to deal with Clifford Olson, who murdered their child, applying for parole again. So there is like that component, but it wasn't enough for the courts to be like, no, like you can't stomp on somebody's due process rights because of this. And now the reason I wanted to bring this up and have the conversation is because we see what's happening right now in America. In America, and Rio and I talked about this extensively this week because it's getting worse. Trump is disappearing people now to El Salvadorian prisons. Notably this week, since Rio and I recorded, so we didn't talk about this at all, the Supreme Court of the US said, no, you have to get Garcia back, who was a father in Maryland, who the Trump administration said that it was an administrative error and he never should have been sent back to El Salvador. And the Supreme Court said, okay, Trump administration, you need to facilitate the return of this person who shouldn't have gone there. Fast forward, Trump has Bukele in his office who says, no, I'm not returning him because that would be like smuggling a terrorist into the US.
Yeah, it's a
What?
very sad situation.
Like that
Everyone,
whole thing is like insane. And
it's mhm,
I think keeping this like Canada based, there is a reason to be concerned
mhm,
that somebody that wants to sit as the Prime Minister of Canada is just outright saying, no, even though I have tools to do this, I'm just going to use the notwithstanding clause. And he would be the first, I remind you, the first federal government to ever do this. It's been used by provinces, mainly Quebec and Alberta, in exactly the ways you think.
mhm,
And Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan did it too.
mhm,
But a federal government has never done this. Not even Harper did this
mhm,
to get his MMSs passed.
mhm,
So that's sort of like the overview.
mhm.
I guess I'll let you kind of take it from there because I think it's clear how like outraged I am while I get my thoughts back together.
Yeah, there's lots of problems with that for sure. Like, and there's so much to unpack in this situation.
Well,
Like,
and
there's
for our listeners too, you have a background in criminal justice. Am I remembering that correctly? Like, did you take anything or is that real?
I worked in criminal justice.
Okay, you worked in criminal justice,
I
right? I
worked
knew
in
you had
I worked
something.
at the Crown Prosecutor's office for about half a year. So I got to see some of the criminal cases and various cases from drunk driving, sexual abuse, various types of things like that.
Yeah,
And
I just want our listeners to kind of know where we're coming from.
yeah, and so I have, I guess you can say, the very practical aspect to this. And
Practical application.
there we go. And I come from it from, again, the business point of view again as well. And remember who I am. I'm a conservative, fiscal conservative with a mentality of social causes, right? So just for your background. So
Man, we
yeah,
should have Rio here for this one.
yeah, I think it would have been a great conversation to have all three of us, but now that I'm here, so I'll have to talk about it anyway. But it's definitely a little bit of concern for
Yeah.
sure. And like, I get why he wants to be tough on crime, but at the same time, it's concerning. And when you start to think about these things through, you start realizing, is he really there just to be tough on crime? Or is he really trying to push his agenda through? Right? And
And
what he
what's
wants
he gonna
for.
do?
And
Like,
the extent,
does it
right?
stop here? I guess is my question.
And I don't think it will stop here. Like, I'm sure like he'll push a lot of things through, right? But at the same time, it seems like he's willing to take people's rights and takes people's due process and really push his own vision through, and also and really do things that he's not respecting the Constitution, which is what you said. You talked about Trump, and you see what Trump's doing overseas with the El Salvadorian guy and things like that. That's a problem. That's a very, very sad
Well, and I
situation.
guess it's kind of like I worry, and I'm not saying that like Poilievre wants to like send Canadians to El Salvador, so like nobody come at me in the comments. But at the same time, when you have a national leader such as Poilievre in a party that is talking about basically abandoning due process in certain aspects of things, and then you look at what's happening around the world now, norms aren't enough to keep democracy going right now.
Yeah, and
And
that's a
that's why
problem.
I'm concerned here. Is he going to look at the US and go, huh, I wonder if I can get away with some of this shit?
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised, honestly. He's playing from the same playbook Trump is right now, to some extent. Remember, part of his base is Trump supporters.
Exactly.
And so, like, that's the concern. Like, and yes, I agree, being tough on crime is one thing. And some of these criminals that do stupid things, yeah, you need to punish them. But at the same time, is it right to take these rights away? I don't know. I don't think so, right? But at the same time, he's talking like Trump to some extent on this part. Is he Trump? No, he's definitely not like
Not
Trump by any
yet.
means. Not yet anyway. Maybe he could be, but I don't know. Maybe somebody can say if he is or not. But I don't know whether he's Trump. But at the same time, he's definitely starting to act and starting to push things through that are just becoming questionable, right? Ethically, but also rights. Do you really want someone to take your rights away?
Well, and I guess like my concern here is like in both RV Nur and RV Lloyd, those were the two Supreme Court cases in Canada looking at minimum mandatory sentences, and both of them said hell no. Like these weren't like even close decisions. They were like, no. And so for him to just like shrug and be like, who needs rights?
But at the same
it's
time, you look at what
concerning.
it's concerning. And you look at what he's trying to do. Like, is it part of like this vision that he really wants to do? Or is it really an actual like he's creating more problems than anything? Right?
Yeah. And I guess my question is this his way of pandering to his far right base? Or is this the first step? And
Oh,
I
man.
like in the
Yeah.
world we live in now, I don't want to risk it. Like what's happening in the US breaks my heart. It's absolutely disturbing. And now he's talking about sending flat out American citizens to El Salvador, not just undocumented immigrants that have broken the law mostly just by being undocumented immigrants. So
yeah, it's crazy. Over in the States, it's just absolutely insane. And I'm hearing these things and I sit there, anyone can be deported. Anyone
yeah.
would be sent away.
And that's what concerns me because not this week, but over the weeks, Poilievre has talked about immigration in the same way, including in week 1 of the campaign about mass deportations.
Yeah, and it's scary. Like, honestly,
It's
do
scary.
we want the same type of mentality in Canada?
Yeah.
Like, and like you hear people saying, "Oh, I didn't vote for that." Well, you did because you voted for Trump. And like
you were warned.
and
Well,
like honestly,
okay,
like
but in all fairness, he didn't say I'm going to send immigrants to El Salvador gulags. He just said he was going to deport them. So like maybe people thought like they'd just be sending their immigrants back to where they belong, not El Salvadorian gulags. But for the most part, they were warned about Trump and tariffs. Like they're all complaining about tariffs and like Trump campaigned on tariffs.
And look at Trump. He got the popular vote and he won crazily, handily the electoral college. So when I hear stories on TV from all of these people, "Oh, I'm scared about Trump," I said, "And you voted for him?" Like, and they did vote for him because he won, right?
The crazy stories were like there's people that are coming out and saying that like their spouses got deported for being undocumented or whatever, like problems with their green cards and stuff. And I was like, you're married to like immigrants and you voted for Trump? Are you out of your tree?
Yeah, and like they think that like it's a surprise, but it's not a surprise. Everything that Trump is doing is exactly what he said. Is Pierre going to do the same? Maybe.
I don't, well, and that's the thing, right? Maybe. And that's enough for me to be terrified. I'm not going to the US. I mean, I'm probably on a list at this point, to be totally honest, and would be arrested at the border.
Even
but like
joking people aside, from other countries should be so scared to go to the States right now. They said you need to be very careful. Like even if you're not on a political podcast like us, you definitely should be scared to go there.
There's 2 travel advisories for Canadians going to the US. So like this isn't a small thing. And I think it's something that Canadians really have to look at and kind of evaluate. Like, is this something Poilievre wants to take farther? And we know, not to be like cliche, but total power corrupts. And
yeah,
so,
and we know that, right? And honestly, look at Trump trying to take the total power.
Yeah.
Right. And we see everything he's doing. He signed these executive orders, right?
Thank God we don't have executive orders in Canada.
And that's a totally another issue. I could go into those areas too, right?
But the MPs would, and I guess this is the other thing, right? Like, Poilievre already has a handle on his MPs. Like we've talked about it before. My MP went from somebody that would have meetings with me. We actually worked really well together. We just generally ideologically didn't play up to stuff. But like there were times that he'd email me and say, "Hey, like I know that you have a background in this. We've put this thing forward." Usually it was about crime. And then they'd say like, "Oh, like what are the liberals gonna like, where is the problem, right, that the liberals are gonna have with this?" So like we were always able to like work together, or I'd go to him and be like, "Here's the problem I'm having in Alberta. How do I navigate this from like the federal perspective?" So like we've worked together quite well in the past as like constituent representative type relationship. Now he won't even yell at my comments on Facebook and give me like talking point answers.
But look at another story. He's controlling the media. Like that's a
He's
totally
controlling the media, but the thing about it that worries me is he's also controlling his own MPs. Like my conservative MP has broken party lines in the past on crime legislation, I might add. And said to me, like, I'm not going to say his name because it was like kind of off the books, but he's like, yeah, this crime bill was stupid and I voted against it and my party hated it. Although I guess you could just go look up the like 3 MPs that probably voted against it. But like, he was very much like a what do my constituents want type of MP. And frankly, he's one of the best MPs I've ever had. It's too bad that we like ideologically don't see the same, like,
yeah, and honestly, it's scary. It's scary, right?
It is. And like now Poilievre has muzzled his MPs. So like they're not even allowed to talk. And when he does talk, like even replying to other people on like Facebook or like in public, whatever, it's like, here's the talking points I'm allowed to give to you. And like there was one where I was like, what you just said doesn't even make sense. Like it's just a bunch of Poilievre talking points that's not about the question you were just asked. And that's what's so concerning when I see something like this, because how are you to give Poilievre the benefit of the doubt, whom, by the way, said tonight, just again in the hour that I watched of the debate, they were asking him, well, like, where's your platform? And he was like, oh, it'll be out at this weekend. So like $10 says he's going to drop it like Sunday afternoon or something, right? Like Easter, nobody's paying attention.
Honestly,
so
or dropping nothing at all. Like those politicians lie through their teeth.
Right? So like, how do you give this person the benefit of the doubt?
Like honestly, you hear these politicians say all the time, like, I want to drop these policies, and they're not dropping the policies.
Yeah.
And they're not even costing them out.
Yeah.
Like, look, we talked about it earlier. These numbers don't even make sense.
Well, and like even in this that we're talking about now, there is literally a legal way for him to do this properly. I mean, chances are it wouldn't actually like stand up to the Oakes test, which is probably why he would just use the notwithstanding clause. But like there is a legal way for him to approach this. He can also consult at any time with the Supreme Court, because in Canada, legislators are allowed to do that and basically say, go to the Supreme Court and say, hypothetically, I want to do X. What would your hypothetical ruling be? Like, how do I, like, they're allowed to consult with the Supreme Court. So there are ways where he can try to do this like legally. He can even like then use the notwithstanding clause and say like, not that I would think it's appalling, but like he could try to do this, fail, and then say like, okay, I'm still working with the Supreme Court, so I'm going to use the notwithstanding clause because it'll be up for review in 5 years. And during that 5-year period, my government will be working with the Supreme Court on the Oakes test, getting their feedback to try to figure out like how to do this. And we saw something similar with Harper when the prostitution laws came out. If you remember, the Supreme Court overturned some prostitution laws, and Harper put in a different law and was like working with, so like there's a way to do this to kind of like be open, transparent, and not tramp completely on people's due process, right?
And that's a scary part. Like for me, that just freaks me out. And honestly, like, is that worth the risk? That's up to voters. Like it's definitely not worth the risk for me either. Like, just all kidding aside, but are the others willing to see past all of that stuff?
And I guess that's the thing, right? And like right now, what scares me so much in the US is people like podcasters and journalists are saying like, if they can do this to an immigrant, and now they're talking about taking US citizens and throwing them in a gulag. And keep in mind, this is the same administration who is now saying vandalism of Teslas is domestic terrorism. Like, I don't think you should be vandalizing Teslas, but it's also not domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
And so crazy. Those people, like, you're going to send them to El Salvador. So I guess my point is like, it can happen to you. It's like, you know, the thing, right? Like first they came for the disabled, then they came for the Ukrainians, then they came for the Jewish people. Well, by the time they get to you, there's nobody left.
And that's the word.
Proceed calling me a fearmonger in the comments, people.
You know, like I understand. It's definitely fearful. And like I totally like do I think he's going to do it? I hope he doesn't do it. Like I really don't. But at the same time, I think he will. Like, I
Yeah.
think the type of person he is, he will do what he needs to do.
Well, just based on his past legislation and what he's voted for.
And honestly, we don't
Not
want
even the type of person that he is. Just look at his history.
Yeah, and like that's the one thing. Unfortunately, unfortunately enough, Carney doesn't have a history. So,
And I think that's kind of also why Canadians are leaning so heavily, appearingly so, to Carney. So anyway, I'll stop ranting. Do you have any kind of last minute things to say about?
no, just be careful, right? On this
Careful, yeah.
policy, and
Pay
make sure you
attention.
understand.
That's what I would say. Pay attention.
And understand what's going on, and make sure you understand. Could you live with what's going on with this? That's all on that.
Yeah. Cool. I have nothing last minute to say about Poilievre. Do you have anything like on any of like the crime stuff or Carney? Any kind of last minute comments?
I would just say, just be careful and read these policies carefully, because if your rights are being infringed, that's a problem.
Yeah. Maybe read the charter or the
That helps too. That helps too.
The charter.
That's important. You should be understanding the charter anyway.
Yeah, and stay informed, guys. Like, I don't care where you get your media from, like whether it's CBC, National Post, I've said it before, just know what's going on. Even if you only watch like half an hour of the debate tomorrow, like try to tune in, see what people are saying, and pay attention to kind of the world around us and where we're at. Other than that, we'll see you next week. We're going to talk about the debates. Maybe I'll see if I can like drag Rio into it. I don't know if he will or not, because he's like feeling super mentally depressed about everything. But we'll be back next week. This episode will be out Friday, and then tomorrow for you guys, which will be Saturday, we're going to drop a bonus 20-30 minute episode where we're going to talk about Gen Z and how young men seem to be sliding more conservatism, not just in Canada, but worldwide, but it is coming out in the research in Canada. So we kind of want to have a quick conversation about that and what that looks like and maybe kind of why. So other than that, we will see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.
Okay.